Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to announce that we're starting the webinar, Best Available Techniques for Industrial Emission Prevention and Control, Insights from Thermal Power Plants and Iron and Steel Sectors. Thank you very much for participating in the webinar today. I'm Naoko Moritani from the Environment, Health and Safety Division of the Environmental Directorate of the OECD. I'd like to share Zoom instructions before we start our session. We have Q&A function. You are welcome to submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A feature in the Zoom control panel. Please specify the intended speaker and add your email address to your question, since we may answer questions via bilateral correspondence due to the time constraint. Regarding the chat function, we'll use the chat to share useful information throughout the meeting. Please refrain from sending questions to the speakers via that chat. Please use the Q&A function for that purpose. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available afterwards at the specific OECD webpage, which we will post in the chat box later on. So, welcome to today's webinar on best available techniques. As you may know, OECD have been working for 10 years by sharing our experiences, knowledge, and best practices of the countries, but applications to help countries prevent and manage industrial pollution. This webinar is part of the OECD's continuing work to enhance industrial emissions prevention and control. The information of this webinar is derived from two reports with cross-country analysis of BAT for six specific industrial sectors. Among the six sectors, we will focus on iron and steel production and thermal power plants today. The webinar will explore how governments are using best available techniques to prevent and control industrial emissions in those two specific areas, highlighting key environmental challenges, common emission control techniques, and opportunities for greater harmonization of BAT approaches across countries and industries. We'll start with an overview of our OECD BAT project. My colleague, Ms. Barak Eliasa, will briefly introduce our project. Barak, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, Naoko. We'd like to start the webinar by introducing our project. Firstly, I'd like to mention our objectives of the project. So our main goal is to present and exchange best practices across countries that already have a BAT-based permitting system, but also provide guidances to those countries that are seeking to adopt BAT-based approach for the first time. While doing so, we're trying to achieve some progress towards sustainable development goals, particularly the target on environmental sound management of chemicals. How we do that is that we have an expert group on BATs. So this expert group was established back in 2015, and ever since it has increased tenfold in size. Momentarily, we have 162 members, experts from over 40 countries and organizations. The expert group not only welcomes expertise from OECD member governments, but we also welcome expertise from non-member OECD governments, industrial associations, key partner countries such as India, as well as accession countries and intergovernmental organizations. We meet once a year face to face, and once a year we have a teleconference, which is a half day. And aside these two meetings, we frequently exchange by emails. This year, we will be hosting our 10th year anniversary, and it will be hosted by our expert group members from Korea. To mention a little bit of our publications, we work in phases of 3 years. In our first 3 years phase, we touched upon collecting policies on BATs or similar concepts. Based on the interests and needs expressed from our expert group members, we developed the phase two, which comprised of a BAT guidance document, a study on value chain aspects of determining BAT, as well as one of the mentions of this webinar, a cross-country comparison of selected BREFs, and it was published in 2022. Last year, we wrapped up our phase three, which also included a cross-country comparison of selected BREF documents, as well as offering two capacity workshops hosted in Vietnam and India, as well as a final report that mentioned of an identifying innovation and emerging techniques for potential BAT determination. We are currently in our phase four, which recently commenced. So for the next 3 years, we'll be working on the role of BAT in hydrogen production. We'll be working on the role of BAT in the recovery of secondary raw materials, as well as also provide capacity building workshops tailored to the needs of the countries who expressed interest. Aside our publications, we do have several online resources, one of which is this website that lists the BREFs BAT reference documents from up to 8 jurisdictions. So from this website, you can collect and see what are the available BAT reference documents or similar documents available in multiple sectors and multiple languages that it is available. With that, I'd like to pass the floor to Nauko.
Thank you very much, Barak, for the introductory presentation. Now we would like to move to the session two, iron and steel sector. So I would like to invite speakers. First, I would like to pass the floor to Barak for introducing our OECD report. And then after that, I'd like to invite Mr. Sebastian Plickert from the German Environment Agency. And then I will invite Mr. Philgu Kang from the National Institute of Environmental Research of Korea. First, Barak, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. We'd like to start by introducing our cross-country analysis report that actually consists of 3 sectors. But for today's session, we will be discussing on the iron and steel segment of the Activity 7 report. The goal of this report was to compare BATs and BAT-associated emission or performance levels across multiple countries. So our goal was to collect BATs for selected sectors, as well as the BAT-associated emission levels for the key pollutants that were selected as important. While doing so, the overall goal of this report was to facilitate and support the harmonization of BAT environmental limits across countries. How we did that, we have collected 6 BREF or BREF-like documents from 6 jurisdictions. So we had BREF documents from Korea, India, European Commission, China, US, and World Bank Commission, World Bank. And for that, we had chosen to focus on iron and steel, paper and pulp, and waste incinerations. Essentially, what we did was screen out and analyze the BATs and BAT emission levels of various pollutants for their air and water emissions. Once we commenced on analyzing the BREF documents, we've listed what are the coverages of the iron and steel plants available within each BREF. So for our reference, we've taken the example from EU BREF. Based on the discussions we had within our expert group, we've chosen to focus on sinter plants, blast furnaces, as well as the electric arc furnace steel making and casting for comparing within this report. I've listed all of the pollutants that were discussed within this report, but for the purposes of this webinar, I'd like to focus on the segment for the iron and steel. So as you will see, there are multiple pollutants that were deemed critical for various countries, starting with the air emissions from the sinter plants, dust, nitrogen oxide, sulfur oxide, mercury, and dioxins were discussed. Furthermore, in blast furnaces, we've looked at air emissions of dust as well as the water release of cyanide and heavy metals, lead and zinc. For the electric arc furnaces, we've compared the air emissions of dust, mercury, dioxins, as well as water releases of zinc. How we screened out the BIT approaches for this sector, considering that there are diversities within the sectors, we've divided into three main components. First, we've collected and compared the general BATs, which are essentially good environmental practices mentioned within the BREF documents, regardless of its sector. So these are good practices that are deemed important for all of the sectors. Then we have screened out key environmental indicators specific, which can be pollution specific BATs or particularly use particular BATs for environmental media chosen, such as air, water, or soil. Then we have noticed that there are subsectoral specific BATs that are critical for either for the specific processes in the sector itself, such as iron and steel making, and these will have specific BATs particular for that subsector. We have collected multiple information on VATs and for the selected pollutants that were discussed and deemed important for multiple countries. I've added the images of the tables that on the screen you may see, but we had collected further information that you may check within our report to reflect a little bit on what we have collected from air for the air emissions from sinter plants. Nitrogen oxides had commonly and widely applied selective non-catalytic reduction SNCR, as well as there were promotions of process integrated measures. For the SOx emissions, there were mentions of flue gas desulfurization, especially the wet FGDs. For the dust or particulate matter emission prevention, there were commonly noted bag filters as well as ESPs. For mercury, there were a lot of mentions of process integrated controls to actually control the input material, the raw material, as well as there were abatement measures that were suggested, such as the bag filters, flue gas scrubbing, as well as activated carbon injection. For dioxins, it was also another process integrated prevention method collected from the BREFs. So mostly there were mentions of raw material selections as well as process optimization. There were also mentions of SCR, activated carbon injection, as well as fabric filters usage across the BREFs. When we looked at the common BITs from the blast furnaces, we were able to collect the bath for the dust, and there were common mentions of BIT bag filters as well as electrostatic precipitors, just like it was mentioned in the sinter plants. For the water releases of cyanides, there were diversities in the BAT approaches that were mentioned within the BREF documents, such as there were in China, there were pre-treatment and biochemical techniques, and in the EU, there were mentions of coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation, and there were differences in the US BREF-like document, which mentioned alkaline and breakpoint chlorination. For the heavy metal releases to water, EU again mentioned flocculation and sedimentation, and US mentioned of high rate recycling systems, blowdown treatment, metal precipitation, and filtrations. For the BAT approaches in electric arc furnaces, as you will notice, the dust BAT seems to be common across regardless of the plant specification. So for dust, the BATs mentioned were back filters or high frequency ESPs. For the emissions of mercury and dioxin, again there was a process control mentioned across the BATs, such as the raw material substitutions, input control, as well as activated carbon injection, fabric filters, and SNCR for dioxin control for advanced applications. For the zinc recovery releases to the water, there were diverse approaches again across the BREF documents, such as in China, there were mentions of fire wet techniques for furnace dust, whereas in EU there were water recirculation, solid or oil removal, minimize wastewater discharge from the casting. For the BAT's associated emission levels for these pollutants that were covered within the report, we have collected multiple emission levels that are mentioned in the reports. While also collecting BAT associated emission levels, we try to collect wherever there were information, averaging periods, the reference conditions, as well as monitoring standards. I would like to also a little bit explain on the commonalities that were observed for the bad associated emission levels and the varieties that we've observed. So we've noticed that there are quite a bit of regulations and control measures implemented for the majority of the pollutants, which means that the countries are taking them for really key environmental indicators within the iron and steel sectors. We've also noticed that across the countries there are shared BATs, as I've noted before, so means that the countries are looking forward to harmonizing environmental control measures. We've also noticed that there were commonalities such as the TEQ-based dioximetrics, which allowed global comparison across the countries. And we've noticed for the water releases of cyanide, lead, and zinc, the associated emission levels seemed high alignment across a couple of countries, such as EU, US, and World Bank countries. However, there were also differences that we have noticed across the governments for certain pollutants, such as the stringency levels have varied quite a bit between the particulate matter between EU to India. And there were also changing information on averaging periods, whether it was daily, monthly, or unspecified information. Monitoring standards have varied across the countries too, whether it was continuous, random, or periodic elsewhere. What we've also noticed is that nitrogen oxide and the nitrogen sulfur oxide limits actually reflected more on the fuel type chosen and the policy differences of the countries that covered these pollutants as key environmental indicators. In conclusion, what we've noted is that there are common and varying approaches to managing industrial pollution in the iron and steel sector, but we've also noted the common end-of-pipe techniques for certain pollutants such as nitrogen oxide and particulate matter, which means there is a shared recognition of effective BATs across jurisdictions. There were also different pollutants with different BATs, which meant actually there were different processes and end products. So the BATs diverse due to these two policies. And we've also noted that not only end of pipe techniques were employed, but process integrated measures such as low NOx burners were also employed for nearly all of the sectors. And with that, I'd like to pass the floor back to Nakov.
Thank you very much, Parag. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Sebastian Plickett to present EU BREF on iron and steel.
Hello, good morning. Does everybody hear me? Hopefully, yes. So I would like to give a short presentation on the EU BREF and the BAT conclusions on iron and steel production as they were reflected in the OECD report. So let's start with the next slide. It's just to show you an overview of the different iron and steel production routes, and as far as they are currently applied in the European Union. So on the left hand, you see the blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace route, which is mainly based on sinter or pellets and the use of coke. So this is worldwide the dominating production route. On the right-hand side, you see the electric arc furnace route, which usually is based on 100% scrap. And these are the two main routes that are operated in the EU, and hence also that are the routes that are actually reflected in the BREF. And in the middle, you see the production route based on direct reduction in combination with the electric arc furnace. At the time of the writing of the BREF, this was only applied in one plant in Europe, and therefore that was not really covered by the BREF. It was mentioned, but not covered with BAT and BAT conclusions. But that will probably need to be addressed in the future. Next slide, please. So here only to show you, you see there are a lot of iron and steel plants in the EU. So at the time of when the BREF was written, it was in total 138. There are 38 integrated steelworks and around 100 electric steelworks. So they usually have a different capacity. Integrated steelworks are much bigger, and in total, the steel production mostly, so 56%, comes from integrated steelworks, and the lesser part from electric arc furnaces. Next slide, please. So here you see the EU BREF as well as the BAT conclusion. And I just want to explain a bit the difference between the two documents. So the iron steel BREF is the basic document that is elaborated with the technical experts and includes all the technical descriptions. And at the end, from the BREF, the core information is taken out and put into a BAT conclusion, which is then a legal document, a decision document of the European Commission that has to be implemented by the member states. And so within 4 years after publication, that means until March 2016, all these requirements from the BAT conclusions had to be implemented via reconsidering the permits, if necessary, updating the permits, and whenever the new permit conditions require the retrofitting of installation, this also had to be completed until March 2016. So it's not so brand new. I will address this later. Next slide, please. So what do you find in the iron and steel BREF? So after some general information on the processes and techniques, there you find more comprehensive chapters on the different plant types. There's a cinder plants, pelletization plants, coke oven plants, blast furnaces, basic oxygen steel making and casting, and then electric arc furnace. And then the core information is then condensed into the BAT conclusions for iron and steel projection, which is then later adopted by the EU Commission and so they becoming the legal document on the legal requirements. Next, please. Yes, here you see within the individual chapters on the plant types, you find first the description of the applied processes and techniques, then the current emission and consumption levels, and then the techniques to consider in the determination of plant. Next, please. Within the chapter of BAT conclusions, there is also a separate subchapter which includes the BAT conclusions, the specific BAT conclusions for cinder plants. And the same substructure also exists, of course, for the other plant types. Next slide, please. So when you look at the iron steel BREF, it's like a telephone dictionary, so a very thick piece of paper. So the question is how to read it. So if you look for general information on one of the processes, for example, on coking plants or blast furnace, then you should start right from the beginning of the respective chapter 3 to 8. If you look for special technical solutions for an issue, then first it would be good to look into the chapter 2, general techniques. And if you don't find things there, then go to the respective chapter 3 and 8. And in particular, there are subchapter 3 where the technique to considers are presented. And last point, if you are interested in environmental standards in EU, then you have to look for this for the general or plant-specific BAT conclusions. And if you want to look for details on the techniques, then you have to refer back to chapter 2 or chapter 3 to the A3 of the BREF. Next slide, please. So what is the subject of the BAT conclusions of iron and steel? From all the BAT conclusions, most of them, almost half of them, 44 in numbers, that address air emissions. There are 16 BAT conclusions referring to water use and wastewater, another 16 referring to energy consumption, 12 referring to production residues, 2 conclusions addressing specifically noise, and then 5 addressing other general aspects. As I mentioned before, the scope of the BREF is cinder plants, pellet plants, coke oven plants, blast furnaces, basic oxygen steel plants, and electric arc furnace steel plants. So, and from all the BAT conclusions, there are 30 that include BAT-associated emission levels. Next slide, please. So in the general section, general BAT conclusions for iron and steel production, these BAT conclusions address, for example, environmental management systems, questions of energy management, material management, process residues, diffuse dust emissions, especially for material storage, handling, and so on. Then wastewater management, monitoring, decommissioning, and at last, noise reduction. Next slide, please. So here you see one example for monitoring, as it was mentioned in Barak's presentation before. In general, he said BAT is to measure stack emissions of pollutants from the main emission sources wherever BAT-associated emission levels are given, and also in process gas-fired power plants and iron steel works. So that's the general requirement to measure stack emissions. That means usually to monitor them periodically. And in addition to that, the BAT conclusions also include the requirement to use continuous measurements for specific pollutants at the individual plant types, for example, for dust and wakes and SO2 from cinder strands, and so on. Next slide, please. Next slide. I don't see it yet.
I'm sorry, 1 second.
Yes, thank you. So with regard to cinder strand dust emissions, so this is still the main source for dust emissions and also the dominating source for dioxin emissions. So that was the crucial discussion within all the BREF process. So our conclusion was to reduce dust emissions by means of a back filter with a BAT associated emission level of less than 1 to 50 milligrams per cubic meter. In addition to that, for existing plants, it was also considered BAT to use advanced electric ESPs. So when back filters are not applicable, so usually also for existing plant, it was anticipated that it would be possible to apply back filters to existing plants, but there may be some circumstances where back filters are not applicable. So then BAT is to use advanced ESPs, and then the BAT-associated emission level is higher from 20 to 40 milligram because it's not considered also possible to achieve levels below 15 with an ESP. So, and I would also like to highlight the link between dust emissions and dioxin emissions, because usually for removing dioxin from the waste gas, they are abated by the injection of absorption agents, for example, activated coal, and then the performance of the dedusting technique also determines the level of dioxin emissions. Next slide, please. So here you see the BAT conclusion for the dioxin emissions that are related, and I would like to highlight here in the conclusions. So we have the three elements. First, the primary measures, how to avoid the creation of dioxin. Then the second point is the secondary measure, how to abate the dioxin emissions, in this case by injection of absorption agents, and then have a good dedusting system. And the third element is then the BAT associated emission levels, in this case up to 0.2 nanograms for the back filter and up to 0.4 for the advanced ESP, both determined for a 6 to 8 hour random sample under steady state conditions. So, and in this case, as I put below, so in Germany also we have implemented this as an ELB in our national legislation, the TA Luft. And then there we did it in a way that we set a limit value for 0.2 nanograms, and that was complemented by a target value of 0.1 nanograms. And we also have a special regulation on dioxin from existing plants equipped with an ESP, but this special regulation expired in March 2020. Next slide, please. So in the BREF comparison, we also have addressed the dust emissions from the blast furnaces. That means from the cast house. And I would like to have a short look on this BAT conclusions, because it is in fact addressing diffuse emissions. And on the right hand, you see a chart showing the total emission load, total dust emissions from the German iron and steel plants expressed in kilotons per year. And in the columns, you see the lower ones are the emissions from channeled sources, and the upper ones are from diffuse sources. And when you look at the columns, the figures given for the blast furnace, you see that 2/3 of the dust emissions are diffuse. So the essential point is to capture the diffuse emissions. And only if you capture them appropriately, then it's reasonable to have, or then it helps much to give to set a good emission level. So here we have in the BAT conclusions at first the BAT description, and then after that then the BAT associated emission level, in this case up to 50 milligrams per cubic meter. Next slide, please. We also address the wastewater from blast furnace, as it is also reflected in the OECD comparison report. So we have here for the wastewater from the blast furnace gas treatment, we have several BAT associated emission levels. The techniques to be used are flocculation and sedimentation, and the reduction of easily released cyanides. So we have BAT associated emission levels for suspended solids, iron, lead, zinc, and cyanide. And in Germany, we have implemented these via the corresponding annex of our German wastewater ordinance. And most of the values were already in our wastewater ordinance, but we had, when implementing the BAT conclusions, we had to add an additional limit value for suspended solids. Next slide, please. Here, I would like to give you a short outlook. So, as I already mentioned, the BREF that was presented here and that was reflected in the OECD report was from 2012, so not so very new. And accordingly, a revision of the BREF and the BAT conclusions for iron and steel is scheduled to start in the next year and then probably be finalized in 2029. And in this revision, there are several things that have to be done. Of course, first thing is to reflect any progress in BAT since the last revision. Another issue is to reflect the new provisions of the updated EU Industrial Emissions Directive from 2024 that inter alia includes the requirement to set the strictest achievable emission limit values by applying BAT considering the entire BAT-AL range. As you have seen, BAT-associated emission levels are always expressed as a range, for example, from 5 to 50 milligrams. And the IED now provides for setting the strictest emission level values within this range. So, and that of course needs to be reflected when the ranges are defined in the BAT conclusions. Another new requirement is to set binding values for environmental performance, for example, for energy or material consumption, that are difficult to define, but we have to address this in the new BAT conclusions. And the third important point is that we need to include information as well as BAT conclusions for new relevant process types, namely for the direct reduction plants, which are currently already erected, some of them in the course of within the aims to decarbonize iron and steel production. So direct reduction plants using either natural gas or eventually hydrogen. So that needs also to be addressed within the BAT conclusions. Next slide. Yes, I'm finished, and I wish you all good luck in promoting the implementation of BAT.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Before we pass the floor to our next speaker, Sebastian, we received a very nice question for you, and since you won't be able to join us at the discussion session, perhaps I can prompt that for you. One of the questions was EU water resilience strategy considered? It was released in 4th of June this year. Any plans for including water efficiency in the document in near future? Perhaps for the EU BREF on iron and steel.
Yes, in fact, this also needs to be reflected. As I said, the new ID provides for requirements on environmental performance, and this also includes water consumption. So we need to address this. In the previous BREF, there is information on water consumption within the plants, but as this is a very site-specific question, there's still a big variety between the plants. So one plant situated at a big river, there the river more or less flows through the iron and steel plant, whereas at other plants you have only a small receiving water body. Of course, they need to recycle a lot of water within, but this needs to be reflected in the next revision of the BREF, of course.
Thank you very much. With that, I believe we thank you, Sebastian, for your time to join us for this webinar. And perhaps we can pass the floor to Dr. Philgo Kang for his presentation on Korean BREF for iron and steel industry. Philgo, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, I'm surprised by how many participants come, and I hope you understand
Early, yes.
that my presentation material were prepared in a simplified form. And so I'd like to introduce shortly KBREF for INS. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Before explaining this general information, I'd like to address that the main difference between EU and Korea in that is that in Korea, BAT is not mandatory. So also our BAT installation was controlled by two law for such as BAT law and air medium law in terms of emission standard. So when you see the BATAEL in the last slide, we if we you don't see the KEI such as dioxin and other things in KBATAEL is not matter in Korea. So steel manufacturing is an industry that makes steel by melting iron or coal and coke using furnace. Korea has three steelworks and 83 steelmaking mills under integrated permission. Currently, the steel manufacturing industry has received integrated permit using our first BREF from 2018 to 2021. Um, Also, we published our second version of BREF last year. So the one major change is in the second version KBREF, and that we added around 30 emerging techniques from POSCO company in Korea. Uh, yes, and also our TWG members is all 19. Yeah, next please. Uh, Before showing this slide, and I also addressed that in my previous presentation, I showed the main difference between first and second version. So major environmental problem in INS are as follows: dust scattering, heavy metal, and dioxins are released into the atmosphere in the process of using iron ore and coal and cokes and scrap metals. In terms of water, leachate generated in the process of spraying water to raw material to prevent the scattering dust, and wastewater used as cooling water in the process are generated. Waste include slag generated by the use of a furnace and scrap iron generated after the polishing process. Next, please. Uh, Total VAT of in KBREF is 122. As you can see, the 24 general VAT includes EMS, environmental monitoring system, and monitoring energy, water, and utility management and environmental management techniques for each material. BATs for raw materials and storage, iron steel making, casting, rolling, extrusion, and included. For your information regarding EMS, in Korea, we have a plan to publish new common BREF, EMS, environmental management system, and energy management system as a common BREF. Maybe next year we will publish. Next, please. This is the example of our BAT from Sinter plant. This VAT is showing the manages exhausted gas of the Sinter strand by a back filter and an ESP. and add NHCO3 to backfilter to remove gaseous pollutants. I think this BAT is very, very similar to EU. Yeah, but if my information is correct, the major challenge is between with EU that uh, uh, we all installation has BAT using back filter. Next, please. This is for blast furnace, and our BAT 65 is that generate electricity by using the upper high pressure of blast furnace, and maybe below this BAT. So here I'd like to address that the Korea BREF, Korea BAT is very, very similar to EU. But the running condition and the AEL is slightly different, but mostly similar. Um, okay, next, please. Uh, Regarding EAF, the main BAT of electric arc furnace is preheating on the shaft furnace. The technique shown in the picture is the technique used by Dongguk Steel in Korea. Electric arcs and shaft ways are attached. Exhaust gas from the electric arc passes through the shaft and preheat the scrap metal with exhaust waste heat from the electric arc. 75% of existing exhaust gas emission is used to preheat. In this way, the use of electro rod can be reduced. Next, please. Yeah. Before showing AEL values, I'd like to address that we have different methodologies to calculate BAT AEL with EU. Also, I presented our unique methodology in my previous presentation, I think in 2018 or 2019. So the direct comparison of our values with EU countries, AEL is not suggested. I will not read these values, but we can compare your values and our values. Also, the negotiation among TWG is similar, and also the I'd like to. I need to say the in Korea we the BAT plans from installations, the renewal interval is 5 year legally. So maybe next year the new cycle of permissions will be in Korea in terms of iron and steel and non-ferrous material, something like that. Yeah, next, please. Yes. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Filger.
Thank you very much for Filgo for your presentation. Now we'd like to move to the section 3, thermal power plant. I'd like to invite Mr. Georgios Chronopoulos from GRC in the European Commission, and then Mr. Filgo Kang again from Korea. First, I'd like to invite our colleague Barak to present our OECD Activity 6 report. Barak, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen again. In our report, we had up to 7 BREF or BREF-like documents, and they were from China, EU, India, Japan's energy efficiency table, South Korea, US, and World Bank's EHS guidelines. For the cross-country analysis, we've essentially focused on 3 main segments, starting with higher BREF issues, in which we assess the qualitative aspects of the BREF documents, such as the scopes and the types, whether it is a minimum standard or guidance, as well as the technical data and production update cycles of those BREFs. As for the activity 7, we have also divided the BAT approaches into 3 main segments: general BAT, BATs used for the KEIs, and specific BATs for the sub-processes. Further in the report, we focused on emission and performance levels specified for the identified KEIs. One of the main segments that I mentioned in the previous slide was the higher BREF level issues. So in this, as this report preceded the activity 7, we decided to collect information on BREF production update processes across these countries, as well as the regulatory context, and if there are financial cost issues associated with the BATs reported within the BREF documents. Then we went into sector-specific information for the sectors chosen. To give an example from the thermal power plants, we've collected background information on the BREFs, whether their issues issue organization and their update or the revision cycle planned. We've also included information on the scopes comparison, such as whether the fuels or the technologies incorporated within the BREFs, the capacity of the plants, the boundaries and the ages of the installations, whether they were making differences in the BATs recommended. We've also noted the environmental issues covered within the BREFs, such as whether the medias were multimedia or single media oriented. We noticed some information on if there were differences in or information provided on the ages and the investment cycles within the BREFs. The BAT approaches, as I mentioned, we have taken a similar approach as we did in activity 7. First, we've collected the good BAT practices, which are generally good environmental practices across the sectors. Then we did KEI specific analysis, whether there were BAT specific to pollutants or the environmental media, such as air and water. And then we tried to collect if there were differences in subsector specific BATs, whether there were coal-fired or gas-fueled specific BATs. We've also, as we've done it for the iron and steel sector, for the thermal power plants, we've collected multiple BATs specific to the KEIs or the pollutants that were selected. But what I'd like to draw your attention is that regardless of the fuel type that were selected, a lot of the BREFs seem to have recommended BATs that are common to both coal-fired and gas-fueled. Aside the commonalities, we've noted that even regardless the pollutant that were chosen, the common BATs were also noted for the TPP, regardless whether it was fueled by gas or coal. Another aspect that we wanted to note was the quantitative BAT, as I mentioned, BAT associated emission levels. We have multiple tables specific to the pollutant itself, and we try to note when the information was available, whether the BAT AL was specific to new plants or existing plants. Some of the remarks that we've raised within the report, for example, starting with the dust, there were significant variations in BAT ALs across the BREFs, even for the new plants. We've also noted that new plant standards often showed more stricter approaches than for the existing plants, for which we had some exceptions noted, particularly for China and some from the EU, where the differences were less pronounced. When we looked at the sulfur oxides and the nitrogen oxide associated emission levels, there were large AL variations observed for both new and existing plants, for which we've noticed several influencing factors, such as whether the fuel type selected and whether it was coal fuel or gas fuel. But we've also noted there were policy differences regarding the applications of fuel gas desulfurization, particularly for the sulfur oxides emissions. What we've noted and in our conclusions for the both reports were that there are supports needed for the harmonization for off-the-bat approaches across the industries. What we said were there were differences in regulatory approaches as well as the BAT implementation. But one of the key elements in the success were the legal statuses of these documents, whether they were guidance documents guiding the countries without making it mandatory of application, or whether they were legally binding standards, which significantly influenced the compliance and enforcement of the BATs and BAT associated emission levels set. We've also noted the differences could be attributable to the specific characteristics of the industrial installations. There are varieties of plants based on the geographical locations that they were. And also one of the major points that were noted, the differences across the governments were the differing environmental concerns taken on board when they were evaluating a sector, particularly for pollutants. But what we can commonly note here is that with the two reports we have published, there are significant benefits in sharing knowledge as well as cooperating for sustainable industrial practices worldwide. I think with that, I can pass the floor to Nako for commencing the other presenters.
Thank
Hello. Most probably Naoko was muted. I don't know if she called me for giving me the floor. If it is the case, okay, thanks. Okay, thank you very much, Naoko, and many thanks to OECD for inviting me to present the European Union BREF on what we call large combustion plan, or as it is stated in the OECD report, thermal power plant. In particular, it's the so-called LCP, Best Available Techniques Reference Document, LCP BREF from August 2017. My name is George Kornopoulos. I work in the EU BRIDE, the European Bureau for Research on Industrial Transformation and Emissions, in the JRC in Seville, where, let's say, we applied the Sevilla process for determining best available techniques and to elaborate the BREF documents for big agro-industrial installations. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the outline of my presentation. First of all, I'm going to present an overview of a large combustion plant in the European Union and their environmental impact, as well as I will continue with the main KPIs covered in the OECD report as presented in the OECD report from the EU BREF perspective, identified best available techniques as associated ranges. And my main emphasis will be in emissions to air from coal and gas-fired installations, as well as on CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. Okay, in the European Union, in total, there are, based on the year 2022 data, more than 4,000 large combustion plant installations that are under the scope of the Industrial Emissions Directive. Just for your information, I think Sebastian presented before a bit about the Industrial Emissions Directive. And this more than 4,000 large combustion plant installations have significant variance in size with a range of size capacities from 50 megawatt up to more than 2,000 megawatt installed thermal capacity. And what is interesting in the distribution of the LCPs, the large combustion plant in the European Union member states, is that 21% of these plants account for 70% of the installed capacity. In actual figures, the large combustion plants in the European Union are responsible for almost 40% of the EU electricity production capacity based on the 2022 year data. Next slide, please. Just two slides about this first slide. It's about the evolution of pollution of the emissions coming out from this large combustion plant in the European Union. And in this graph, you can see that some main pollutants, namely the sulfur dioxide, dust, and nitrogen oxide, are produced. Emissions are presented. You can see that for the dust and sulfur dioxide emissions from large combustion plant, compared to the year 2004, so up to year 2022, in an 18-year period, we have a very drastic decrease in sulfur dioxide and dust emissions by 92%, while during the same period, from 2004 up to 2022, the emissions of the nitrogen oxides were reduced by 70%. So we may consider that we have, let's say, in the last 20 years, a very drastic reduction in the emissions of these three main pollutants coming from LCP installations in the European Union. Next slide, please. Of course, in the large combustion plant, the fuel mix plays a key role. And in this slide, you can see the fuel type used in the large combustion plant in the European Union. You can see that starting from the year 2004, we have a quite stable decrease in the use of coal for electricity production, with a more steep decrease in the period 2017 up to 2020. But what is interesting in the use of coal in electricity production is from the year 2020 up to 2022, there is a small increase in its use, with the result that coal use in electricity production was, for the first time after 2019, higher than the share of use of natural gas. Next slide, please. Of course, the fuels have a significant impact on the type and the quantity of emissions. So let's move now to the key environmental indicators, or key environmental issues, as we name it in the European BREF making process, covered in the OECD Activity 6 report. And I will start from the emissions of dust, particulate matter from coal-fired plants. And following a bit the skeptic, but also Sebastian followed in his approach, I will present you the main identify best available techniques that are associated with the emissions of its parameters. So in this case, with the emissions of dust, and then the very brief presentation of the associated emission limit values or ranges for this pollutant, for this parameter. So in the case of dust of particulate matter emissions from coal-fired plants, the main identified best available techniques were the electrostatic precipitation, back filter, the boiler sorbent injection, either in furnace or in bed, the dry or semi-dry flue gas treatment, or the wet flue gas desulfurization. The associated emission levels range in the EU BREFs. We have a distinction between new and existing plants. So you can see on the left-hand side, on the first column, but for the new plants, the set BATAL range is from 2 to 5 milligrams per normal cubic meter, while for existing, expressed as yearly averages, while for existing plants, there are various ranges with an overall range between 2 and 18, and these various ranges are for different size plants. Larger existing plants, lower ranges, for example, for plants with a thermal installed capacity more than 600 megawatts, the BATL range is between 2 and 10, expressed as yearly averages. Of course, in addition to the yearly averages, the European BREF BAT conclusions set also daily average ranges according to the plant size, with the overall range ranging from 4 up to 22 milligrams per normative meter, or up to between 14 or 28 milligram per normative meter yearly average for plant operating before 7 of January 2014, and this is size dependent. Of course, for all ranges I'm presenting in this presentation, all values are referring to standard condition. That means dry gas at a temperature of 217 degrees Kelvin and a pressure of 1 atmosphere, and expressed as at a reference oxygen level of 6%. Next slide, please. Moving from dust to sulfur dioxide, again from the case of coal-fired plants. Here we have a quite long list of techniques. The main identified best available techniques are the boiler sorbent injection, either in furnace or in bed, the duct sorbent injection, the spray dry absorber, the circulating fluidized bed dry scrubber, wet scrubbing, wet flue gas desulfurization, seawater flue gas desulfurization, combined techniques for the abatement of sulfur oxide emissions and nitrogen oxide emissions, and others. Here you can see a more detailed table according to the ranges of installed capacity. So in the first row of its table, you can see in the left-hand side for new plants, and in the middle column for existing plants, the yearly average BATALs for sulfur dioxide emissions. And you can see that when you move from the lower installed capacity to the higher, the levels are lower. The proposed ranges are low. The ranges that are concluded are lower. Of course, as in the case of dust, in addition to the BATL ranges for yearly averages, we have in the European Union BREF daily averages ranges, and we have some higher associated emission levels also noted for plants with lower operating hours. Two cases, one for the group of plants with maximum operating hours per year, 500 hours, and the second case of 1,500 hours per year in operation for plants in operation before 2014, and for fluidized bed combustion. That was very briefly for the sulfur dioxide emissions, and perhaps we can move on to the next slide, which is associated again in the case of coal-fired plants to NOx emissions. Here, the identified best available techniques are related to combustion optimization, primary techniques for the reduction of nitrogen oxide emissions, such as air stacking or fuel stacking, flue gas recirculation, low NOx burners, SNCR, SCR, and activated carbon injection, or again the combined techniques for abatement of SOx and NOx. Again, the BATA lower range table split it in according to the installed capacity, and again in expressing for new plants in the left-hand side and for existing plants in the yearly averages. Again, the same approach, the highest the installed capacity, the lower the BATA range that were decided. And again, in addition to yearly averages for existing plants, we have daily averages for that were also specified. Some higher BATALs also noted for plants with certain lower operating hours. Again, the same approach, less than 500 hours or less than 1,500 hours operating hours per year for plants in operation before 2014, and for certain fuel and technology variants, for example, for lignite, coal, fluidized bed, and so on. Moving now to the next slide, it's about mercury emissions for coal-fired plants. Here, the identified best available techniques are split into main two categories. Techniques that are not typically addressed the mercury emissions, but they may have an impact on mercury emissions, so we call it techniques that have a co-benefit in mercury emission from general techniques, and these general techniques are the general dedusting techniques like electrostatic precipitate, back filter, boiler sorbent injection in furnace or in bed, dry or semi-dry flue gas, or a wet flue gas desulfurization. And we have also, in addition, specific techniques for mercury emissions abatement, like the carbon sorbent injection in the flue gas, the halogenated additives in fuel or injected in the furnace, the fuel pretreatment, and of course the fuel choice, a primary technique, as also indicated by Berak before. Again, the BATAL range table, split it accordingly for new plants and existing plants. And of course, you can see here the for main two categories of installed capacity, less than 300 megawatts and more than 300 megawatts, and according to the main type of fuel that is used, either it is coal or lignite. And of course, for lignite, due to the indigenous problems of mercury content in lignite, you can see that the agreed BAT-ALs are a bit higher than the ones from coal. Perhaps we can move on to the next slide, which is associated. Now we are moving from the solid fuels to the gas fuel, so it's natural gas-fired plants, and we are talking about NOx emissions. Here, the identified available techniques are mainly a group of primary DNOx techniques that aimed in the reduction of nitrogen oxide emissions, like the air staging or fuel staging, flue gas recirculation, low NOx burners, SCR, selective catalytic reduction, selective not catalytic reduction, and of course, the reduction of the combustion air temperature. Again, here we have the BATAL, the associated emission levels, split again for new plants and existing plants expressed as the averages. Also, we have in addition daily average ranges. And here we have, let's say, according to the type of the process, either for a natural gas turbine or natural gas boiler or natural gas engine. And you can see here which are the associated emission levels that are included in the EU BREF. And just to move on in the next slide, a few words about decarbonization or CO2 emissions. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Yes, and here there is not BATs, not best available techniques about decarbonization in the EU BREF, but chapter 11 of the LCP BREF, which is about emerged technique, have a quite extensive reference to CO2 capture processes, mainly about post-combustion carbon dioxide capture processes, and there is a description of the amine process, the chilled ammonia process, the biocatalysis techniques to remove CO2 from the flue gases. Also, there is extensive reference in oxy-fuel combustion and CO2 capture, and what is called carbon capture readiness. That was all from my side. Perhaps we can move on to my next slide, which is just a thank you message. And I'm passing back the floor to now Gaur to Berak. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Georgios, for your very comprehensive presentation. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Fyogo Kang for presenting the Korean BREF on thermal power plants. Fyogo, you have the floor.
Actually, in this session, I'd like to address BREF's strengths and challenges compared with the other EU BREF. So my presentation file is very, very simple. So major strength is we have much stricter standard for NOx and PM in AEL than EU and US. And also mercury management, we have a higher mercury standard than China and Japan, and comprehensive framework. We have very powerful BAT big data system with installations plan and our permission report and also annual report, something like that. So for this one, I would like to, if OECD have opportunity to show this, I will, or my colleague will present these things in our 10th OECD expert meeting in Korea, hopefully. And also in Korea, we have a powerful real-time monitoring system, such as TMS, telemonitoring system for all sectors. Yes, and our challenges is we have no BAT for CO2 related things because our law didn't cover the climate change things. And mostly our BAT techniques is about qualitative perspective. It should be improved. It's a long respiration. Other thing is I said in the previous session, our BAT standard is just recommendation, not mandatory requirement. Yes, I'd like to finish my presentation there. Thank you.
Now I'd like to move to the session 4. In this session, we will discuss harmonization of BAT approaches across industries. I'd like to first invite Mr. Georgios Chronopoulos again from JRC of European Commission, and Mr. Philgu Khan from Korea. I'd like to also invite Mr. Pablo Delgado from Eurofer, European Steel Association, and Mr. Edward Heath White from UK Steel Association. My colleague Varak will be one of the speakers as well. Here, I would like to hear speakers' views on comparing BREFs across countries and sectors. For example, how do different countries define and apply BAT for emission control in both sectors, or differences in BAT areas and factors influencing variations. And you may want to mention the challenges in harmonizing emission limits across jurisdictions and the commonalities between thermal power plants and iron and steel as well. And you may want to mention the OECD's role in streamlining and harmonizing BAT approaches. Now, I'd like to ask Mr. Josias to provide your views first, if possible.
Thank you, Naoko. And I will start from the last point and let's say the role of OECD. and the role of OECD BAT expert group in promoting and disseminating the bad concept outside the EU frame. I think it's something very important, and we have seen, let's say, that this Activity 6 report was followed also by other, and not only limited in the large combustion plant and iron and steel, but was also in continuation covering other sectors. While I think what is important to understand is that the problems in the environmental issues associated with the operation of large industrial installations are common across the world. And of course, what is needed and it will be of mutual interest and benefit is, let's say, to have lessons learned or approaches that are used in one jurisdiction to be understood and perhaps followed by other. The BAT concept is really important because it's a unique process of having a very sophisticated analysis of data coming from real plants and also a close connection between what are the associated techniques, what are the best available techniques, the techniques that are really effective in achieving a certain environmental performance, which is the associated emission levels or environmental performance levels. In that sense, I think it's the best way to make the link, to make the connection between what are the techniques, what are the available techniques, and to always need to be very careful what is the definition of available techniques and what is the associated emission levels that could be achieved. Of course, in the experience has shown that, as it is also indicated in the OECD report, especially for this Activity 6, in the case of LCP or also in the iron and steel, but there are, let's say, quite a number of commonalities among the BREFs documents of various jurisdictions, but also there are significant difference, and this is totally expected because we are talking about different starting lines from each jurisdiction, different specificities and local conditions that also need to be taken into account. We are talking about industrial production, we are talking about big installations, and of course we know that there is, let's say, an inertia in applying new processes and adopting, let's say, new considerations and new concepts. That was all, let's say, from my side. Many thanks and sorry for being so long.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much just for our role in providing comments. And Fiogo, would you like to provide any views on comparing BREFs across countries and sectors?
If you can pop up my last presentation file I've sent, it'll be very, very helpful.
Just a minute, please. Which one does he need? The ones.
In this panel discussion, I think Activity 6 and 7 all approaches is very, very timely good. So also our phase 4, that's very nice. But my suggestion, maybe it seems that what I suggested maybe somewhat off the main topic, but I discussed my colleague. Next, please.
There is one slide.
Oh, come on. How about showing
The other presentation.
yeah.
No problem.
Thank you. I have discussed with my colleague in Korea, so it is their opinions. Next phase, we, if possible, we would like to enlarge our area of our cooperation. Something like next, please.
We're trying to get it this one.
Yeah. And so currently, our research focused on technical, techniques and uniform standard, and the based on breadth. And but the in my experience on BAT in Korea, the final destination of BAT is the permission of installations for sectors. So I think our 10th OECD expert meeting, we will hold the international conference, on Wednesday. And so I hope it is the only field to discuss our future cooperation field, such as regulatory focus and um, data utilization, and also the emission impact model, and also big data system we called IEPS, Integrated Environmental Permit System, with the including our permission big data, and also, I said before, annual report, something like that. And so my bottom line is I'm very happy this activity 6 and 7 report, but for future, but the enlargement of our cooperation field might be considered together. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Feogu, for suggesting the future direction for the OECD work. And then, as you mentioned, the international conference, which is planned to be held in November this year. Just for your information, as my colleague Barak introduced, we have OECD expert group on BAT. And then our annual meeting will be held in November, and then back to back with that meeting, the Korea will host an international conference. So if you are interested in participating to the conference, you can contact us anytime you want. Now, I'd like to hear the industrial perspectives on that implementation. First, I'd like to ask Mr. Pablo Delgado for providing your views.
Thank you, Naoko, for giving me the floor. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. My name is Pablo Delgado. I'm Environment Regulation Manager at ArcelorMittal. I am based in Brussels, Belgium, and I'm the chair of Eurofer, European Steel Association Industrial Emission Working Group. I would like to thank you, OECD, for the organization of this webinar, and I would like as well to thank you, Berak, Sebastian, George, and Figo for the presentations and the review given of the OECD BREF report and experience in EU and Korean BREF BATs. I think that are very good examples on how the BATs have emerged as a key policy tool for setting emission limit values and other permit conditions to prevent and control industrial emissions, and thus ensuring a high level of protection on the environment. I want to to address in a nutshell five topics. I want to start with technology neutrality. I believe it's important to highlight that the techniques listed in the BREF and described as BAT are neither prescriptive nor exhaustive, and to remind that other techniques may be used and ensure at least an equivalent level of environment protection. This is relevant as well when referring to techniques associated to decarbonization. Industrial operators should not be prescribed to produce steel with one or other technology. The key environmental indicators, key environmental issues of each of the different basket of technologies available should be considered and derive consequent VATs. The selection of one or other decarbonization technologies will depend on different factors and local conditions. For example, the access to sufficient, affordable, clean energy and other inputs. The second point is about integrated approach. When we address a specific key environmental issue, we have to evaluate the overall environment impact in an integrated way. For example, one BAT may have benefits for specific KI, but may have some collateral cross-media effects. For example, increase generation of waste or need more water, more energy. And you need to consider all of these to choose or to evaluate what is the best option. The third aspect is about local conditions and applicability restriction. I want to highlight that not all the BATs may be applied by all the operator sites, and this has to be tailor-made to the specific situation. For example, we refer to the water issue. Before, one plant located in a water stress area may require specific BATs that might differ in case that the same plant would be located in other areas that where the water availability is not at the stake. Furthermore, not all the BATs may be applied in all the scenarios, as in some cases there are some technical limitations that prevent the use one or other BAT. The BAT should be always technically and economically viable, and this means that an evaluation case by case is always recommended. The fourth point is about the cross-country analysis of BAT applies in different jurisdictions. I want to highlight that in the case of BATLs, associated emission levels, we should evaluate carefully all the contextual information associated to the ranges, in particular reference conditions and averaging periods. Furthermore, when we compare a specific range, the monitoring standards play a key role because the use of different standards applicable in different jurisdictions may derive to different results when comparing monitoring of one of the pollutant at the stake is there is no an equivalence. Finally, my last point is about the harmonization of bad approaches, and now I could refer to power plants linked to the iron and steel industry. It is important to remind that the iron and steel process gases are unavoidable produced in the integrated steel works, referring to blast furnace gas, coke oven gas, BOF gas, and the operation of the power plants firing these process gases have some particularities. When we compare the LCP using process gases and the large combustion plants, there are some challenges. The process gases are rising in an irregular way. There are variations in amounts on composition. The storage capacity is limited given the huge volumes the gas produce and leading sometimes with temporal imbalances in the gas demand and supply. And the ultimate goal is to avoid flaring and optimize energy efficiency. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for the good work of OECD on this bad project the last years, and looking forward to continue the good collaboration. Thank you. I hand over to Naoko. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pablo, for providing very important views Especially you highlighted the integrated approach, which I personally think it is very important. And now I would like to invite Mr. Edward Heath White for providing your views.
Yeah, hi there. My name's Edward Heath White. I am Head of Environment and Sustainability for Liberty Steel UK. I'm the Vice Chair of the UK Steel Environment and Climate Change Committee. And I've been involved in the Seville process, the European process, for over a decade now for iron and steel and ferrous metal processing. I think one of the first things that I really want to talk about is how the UK has now moved away from the Seville process and is now looking at creating its own BREFs. Our experience of that. So the first BREF we did with this was the ferrous metal processing BREF that was issued by the EU in December 2022. And about the same time, the UK BREF working group was set off to look at the UK version of it. That process has been quite difficult. And initially we had a big disagreement with the way it was handled. And we had a kick-off meeting, but then we had to redo the kick-off meeting. And this was to do with the way in which, so for the EU process, obviously you've got 27 member states, a lot of data, and you've got key environmental issues that, there's some really key environmental issues that you need to tackle. Now, they may not be the same key environmental issues in the UK. They might be slightly different. And maybe one of those issues wasn't discussed in detail, for example, in the European process. So we wanted to discuss it in more detail in the UK process, but they wouldn't discuss it. So that was a sticking point, which we then managed to get over and discuss that. And that's really highlighting that there are regional differences and differences within industry, within countries and regions. And I suppose what I would say in the UK at the moment is we've gone through that process with the ferrous metal processing BREF, and that is now been stalled in terms of it's not been issued yet. So it's issued in December 2022 for the EU. Our version will not be issued until, I don't think it'll be issued until 2026. Had an indication it's going for public consultation at the in summer this summer, and then it has to go through Parliament for a statutory instrument to be brought before Parliament and then issued. So that has delayed the process. And what that does for industry is it delays our response to those key environmental issues. So we want to know what we're going to invest in years, our capex plans. And if, for example, we have a furnace that needs investment in to improve its environmental performance, then the priority of that is determined by, when does the BREF come into force, and therefore when do we have to comply with the new BAT AEL? And if that's delayed, like it has been, then that delays the capex, that delays the environmental protection. So I think that's a concern for us in industry, is it doesn't give us the right signals to get on with what we need to be getting on with. So that's one issue. So that's the UK BAT process. And I think if we look to the EU now, where we're coming up for the iron and steel BREF, possibly being kicked off in 2026, there are obviously emerging techniques coming through, and we looked at that at the Insight workshop at JRC. There's lots of interesting new developments in the transformation of the iron and steel industry to reduce its carbon emissions. And that will impact on many of the techniques that we use for pollution prevention and control or emissions reduction. However, at the moment, people, I think, are getting a bit confused about emerging techniques and about the techniques we actually use for pollution control. So if we use a fabric filter or back plant to reduce dust from a process, that's a well-known, pollution prevention process. We know what the outputs are from that in terms of what the emissions might be for a metals process. And therefore, I think that should help us when we come to do the iron and steel BREF. Now, the problem we've got in the UK is that we won't be involved in that process. So we'll have to kick off our own process. And how we then take account of the EU BREF, maybe the Korean BREF and other BREFs, will be a key part of that process, I think, because there's only 6 steelworks in the UK, all of them converted into electric arc furnaces, so it'll be a reduced scope. We won't be looking at blast furnaces anymore. We'll be looking primarily at electric arc furnaces and secondary steel making and casting. So that's a simplification for us. And my experience of the European process is that for certain processes, there's been no advancement in the techniques over the last 15 years, 10 years. So I would suggest that maybe the BREF process that's coming up in 2026 might have some ability to just carry over some of the BAT AELs for mature processes. And that would then enable more discussion about how to deal with the transformation and the processes used for pollution prevention and control in the transformation. I think that's my comments. I'd like to thank the OECD. It's been a very interesting process to be involved with and an excellent report. And it's good to see that the sort of BREF and BAT being spread globally so that we can prevent damage to our environment. And that's the key thing for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward. Thank you very much, Edward, for providing your views, sharing your experience on the UK BREF process view, the review of the process. Sorry, the process of the review. And then your suggestion on the next BREF review, as well as your comments on the OECD work. Now I would like to ask my colleague Barak to provide some views.
Sure. I'd like to start with thanking our speakers from both regulatory offices and the industrial associations. We were very pleased to hear the different views, different agencies and different industrial associations. Furthermore, to what we can add on as the OECD Secretariat, we're happy to see the commonalities in BAT approaches taken across different countries, as well as identifying the differences in approaches, which actually increases the lessons learned on how we can tackle pollutants or issues in different approaches, because the success of BAT is relied on its specificity to the country and the pollutant and the industrial streams that they are used for. And I believe with that we can pass on to the mouse to Naoko to conclude the remarks.
Okay, just going to the next session. We may have some time, so I just want to know if the speakers would like to provide further comments on the other speakers. I see none. Then thank you very much for to the speakers again. And then we would like to go to the last session.
Thank you also very much. So today we had our first of the webinar series on BIT, and we focused on thermal power plant section of our Activity 6 report and the iron and steel section of our Activity 7 reports, which are freely available on our websites. In our next webinar, which is scheduled to be held on 3rd of July, we will be focusing on the textile sector of the Activity 6 and paper and pulp sector of the Activity 7. Further along the year, we will be also producing a webinar on cement section of the Activity 6 and waste incineration section of the Activity 7. We'd like to also direct you to our website where this recording of this webinar will be made available. You may also would like to sign up for our newsletter for our other informations and other webinars that are going to come out. And with that, we'd like to thank you for your time to join this webinar and wishing you a very pleasant rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. See you. Right.